Macro photography is often about getting your subject off its background, giving it some definition, some clarity and a bit of punch, which can be really difficult, particularly, so if I've got this scene here, I've got these wonderful purple thistle flowers here, but they're on this really dense, busy background of greenery. And the other problem that I have, if you just think about it in terms of brightness, my subject is roughly the same brightness as its background, which is always really difficult to pull things away from it and make it look really interesting. Luckily, I have this prop black t-shirt. A black background is an incredibly useful thing in almost all photography, and so it's just a key of finding a composition where you can place in a plain background and then figuring out what your exposure is going to be to make the most of it. Here, rather than kind of pick the flowers and disrupt nature too much, I'm going to carefully place this right under my subject there. I really want it to be at quite a nice distance so I can make the most of the depth of field that I'm going to get from my camera. And I want to find a composition that ideally kind of just has, I'll just move these guys out of the way, that just has this lovely purple flower on it, and then ideally nothing else at all. The way that I'm going to do that is through composition and exposure, and understanding both of those things is super important for macro photography. I'm going to use this phone's zoom lens. It has a longer focal length, so it produces images that look like they've got more depth of field. And so from here I can immediately see, I might just tug that down just slightly there. The key to this kind of photography is exposure and composition. We'll deal with composition first. This wide angle of everything is way too cluttered. I can see my entire shirt in the background. It just isn't the tidy composition that I'm after. A quick tap here and I'm using my phone's second lens. It's zoom lens, which has a longer focal length, gives me a bit more definition and a bit more depth of field so that my subject is more well defined. The other thing to look out for is exposure. Obviously with this black background in here, the phone, the camera is trying to expose for both at the same time and getting neither really right. So what I'm going to do is tap on my subject. I'm going to drag this exposure compensation slider downwards, and as we come down, these colours here in my thistle become more saturated, more punchy, more interesting looking, and at the same time this shirt in the background drops all the way down. I'll just get this fluff out of the way there. It drops down, the blacks get crushed, and I get this really nice kind of isolated effect. So that is the frame that I'm after. It's always worth doing that a couple of times just to make sure that you've absolutely caught the best possible focus that you can. And then once my subject is blown into the right place by this rather energetic wind that we've got, I'm going to start shooting. I might also, when I'm working close up with the subject, I might shoot as I move my camera in and out just to make sure that I'm catching something that's really sharp in there. We're going to start shooting, and something in there is going to be exactly the frame that I'm looking for when I go through these pictures in a second. This frame is a disaster and a really good demonstration of why composition and exposure are so important in this type of photography. It's very wide, it's very flat in terms of exposure. My black background just looks like a rag thrown on the ground there. It's choppy, it's messy, it's definitely not one that I'm looking to keep. This frame has way better composition. For this one I used the 2x optical zoom lens, so we've punched in further, and that has the twin effects of firstly cropping out all of that very busy surrounding grass and brush and stuff, and it also increases apparent depth of field, which means that this shirt in the background is now very much reduced in terms of how eye-catching it is, how much definition it has. It's still not quite there in terms of exposure, just because that background is still pretty bright. I've also got lots of highlights in my flowers there, so that would be the last thing to kind of try to fix. This frame, I think pretty much everything has gone right, including the wind dying down just long enough for me to take the shot. As you can see, I've cleared out all of the surrounding kind of elements that were there in the frame that were distracting or obscuring my subject. I've also corrected the exposure so that all of this surrounding background has been dropped down to either totally black or just maybe very slightly more than that. But it looks really clean, really tidy. There's lots of interesting detail that you can get into here. You can see that I've got exactly the right amount of kind of levels in there. It's not too bright, it's not too dark. The background looks perfect. So that's why this is the frame I'm going to keep.